Thanks for joining me for the second of the Making a Regency Reticule series. I will link below for the first video. Today we're going to be transferring and beading our reticule. So first step is transferring our pattern. I'm just going to lay out my fabric. I'm using a black silk taffeta. I want to make sure that the area that I have is large enough to place in an embroidery hoop, which I'm going to use for beading. Then I'm just going to kind of cut the excess off. I don't need all of this fabric when I'm beading. It'll just be a little bit cumbersome. So I'm going to cut the rest of that off. Next, I'm going to be adhering my pattern to my silk. I'm going to be using a spray and bond basting adhesive. This is water soluble, it won't gum up your needles, it's repositionable, and I love this stuff. I will always spray it onto my paper first instead of directly onto my fabric. You should also test this product on your fabric before placing it on your fabric, but again, I've done that. It works fine. It doesn't change the color or anything, and I will always spray onto the paper so that the fabric doesn't absorb too much. Even when I'm quilting, I'll usually spray baste my batting and not my fabric because I don't want any marks. I don't want it to kind of soak into the fabric. So I'm checking my fabric out, making sure that nothing transferred. And then I'm going to quickly baste my pattern to my fabric. So I'm using a silk thread. It's just a gray silk thread, and I'm going to use a large running basting stitches to map out where my stitch line is. I don't want to draw on my fabric. If I make a mistake, it's going to show. I'm going to have to start all over again with new fabric. It's a lot easier to just take out a stitch if it doesn't lay right where I'd like it. I do like using silk thread for basting because it doesn't leave a mark or an indentation where it was placed, where the stitching line was, so stitching with silk is the best. Now I'm going to baste out all three of those borders that I've made, all three that I've drawn. For me, in this technique that I'm using, I don't need to make sure every single basting stitch is even. They just need to be straight on the line. So the length doesn't need to be even for me. With this specific project, I just need to make sure that those lines are straight. So I'm going to do all three, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now I'm going to baste out all three of those borders that I've made, all three that I've drawn. For me, in this technique that I'm using, I don't need to make sure every single basting stitch is even. They just need to be straight on the line. So the length doesn't need to be even for me. With this specific project, I just need to make sure that those lines are straight. So I'm going to do all three, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now that I've finished one border, I'm going to turn it over, make sure everything looks good before I continue on to the next border. The last border. So my camera died when I started taking the pattern off, once I was done sewing down everything. So this is the end of me taking off my pattern. So sorry about that. I'm just gonna rip it right off, being careful not to rip any of the stitches. So I just gently peel it off. Now that everything is transferred, I'm going to hoop up my fabric using a standard hand embroidery hoop. I'm just going to gently hoop this fabric, and then I'll start on my spangles. So I was on a search for a long time for spangles. They're basically flat sequins. So back in the day, in history, they didn't have that like crimped edge. They were completely flat. I did manage to find some dead stock gold spangles. So I will link them below, the store that had them, at least where I got them from. But in this technique I'm using, it's going to be laying the spangles next to each other instead of overlapping them. So in Regency spangles, this is what I saw. They were laid next to each other and secured on each side, on either side. So I'm going to come up from the center, secure it on one side, come back up through the center, secure it on the other side, and then move over half a spangle length to the right to set the next one down. After hours of setting down spangles, I was done. I was ready to do sort of an organic vine-like serpentine beading pattern with some black glass seed beads. That went much more quickly. I'm using the lazy stitch, so it's 3 beads and then a stitch. I come up like a stem stitch next to my previous stitch, and then I continue my pattern. So here you can see the process. I pick up 3 seed beads, I lay them down how I'd like, set that down with a stitch, and then I come up for my next beaded stitch right next to that previous stitch, and I just continue that. So I did mess up the left-hand side of my border. It is organic, but too organic. I'm going to show you instead how I fix it. So as you can see, well, for you it's right. The right side is a little wonky. Right now I'm just finishing up the top of my vine, and then I will go back and I'll fix that really weird little curve right there. So I did end up pulling out the entire left-hand side. I left myself tails so that I could knot the thread at the back. The great thing about the lazy stitch is that if you pop a thread, or like if a thread rips, all of your beads won't go spilling off because it kind of acts as a back stitch almost. That's why I really love using that lazy stitch. And I'm going to now create a better serpentine pattern on the left-hand side. Now that I'm done with my black vines, I'm going to add little amber, like light gold accents. Those are going to look like little leaves. I'm going to use 2 per little leaf, and I'm just going to kind of alternate them on the vine. I decided not to do a third border. My hands were hurting a little bit. I had already been sewing for about 6 hours at this point, or beading for 6 hours at this point total. So I kind of just wanted to add little corner accents instead of doing the entire outline. So I'm doing 1 spangle with 3 little rays of seed beads that radiate off of it. also at this point that I kind of realized that this looks like a morning reticule. It's kind of like vaguely coffin shaped a little bit, or like, I don't know. It's an interesting shape. And then with the black and gold, which are traditionally mourning colors at this period of time, this definitely looks like a morning reticule. I may just have to make a half mourning gown at some point. So that's an interesting development. I do love like researching mourning practices, so I guess maybe it was sort of a subliminal thing, me doing this, but I like it. I think it's beautiful, so I'm gonna stick with it. So here is my finished beading. It's got those little corner accents, it's got my center border. I may eventually put something in the center of the border, but I kind of like it just as it is. I'm going to loosen up that embroidery hoop, and my next step is to sew everything together. So that'll be my next video. I'll show you how to do a one seam construction for this bag. These are all of the tools I used for my project. It took me about 6.5 hours to get this fully beaded. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.